You're taking a look inside Kansas politics. Welcome in. I'm Rebecca Chung. A legal battle is underway in Shawnee County. Attorney General Chris Kobach is challenging the Kansas Department of Revenue over gender markers on driver's licenses. The ACLU is stepping in, and we're speaking today with the ACLU legal fellow, D.C. Hebert. DC, before we get into the driver's license court fight, another decision was made in KCK regarding gender markers on birth certificates. A federal judge struck down part of a 2019 consent decree that would require the state to make those changes. We spoke with the Attorney General. He said he wasn't surprised about this, but what was your reaction when that decision came down? We were disappointed to see that the consent order isn't still in place going forward in the state, because it is very vital for trans folks in the state of Kansas to be able to access identity documents that reflect their true gender. And so not only were we disappointed to see that decision come down, but we were disappointed to see KDHE then follow up by changing its policy to officially stop offering gender marker amendments on birth certificates going forward. Now, I know the judge in that case who made the decision, he says the law clearly states that these documents, like birth certificates, must reflect either male or female at birth. That's based on the state's new law, SB 180, that defines biological sex. However, he didn't rule on whether that law was constitutional. That remains to be determined. Are you worried that this decision, though, could impact how this legal battle over driver's licenses plays out?
So, we want to make clear that the Foster v. Anderson decision that you're talking about in that case in federal district court is separate from what's happening in Kansas state court with Kansas v. Harper and the driver's license context. I think those are two very, very different identity documents that are oversaw by completely different departments of the state, and so we view them as separate issues. And so in our litigation in Kansas v. Harper, we're focusing solely on SB 180 as applied to the context of KDOR and driver's licenses.
Now, the ACLU is intervening in this legal battle in Shawnee County. Why is that? What questions are being raised about the state's law defining biological sex?
So I think it's important to note the framing of this lawsuit before the ACLU intervened. And so what occurred was the Attorney General brought a lawsuit against the Kansas Department of Revenue to enforce his interpretation of SB 180. And his interpretation of that law is that KDOR is not allowed to issue gender marker amendments on driver's licenses for trans folks. And KDOR is arguing that that is not their read of SB 180, and that in fact they can continue to issue those gender marker changes under the law. And the ACLU of Kansas has intervened on behalf of 5 transgender Kansans in the state who also agree with KDOR's interpretation that SB 180 does not require them to stop issuing gender marker changes. But further, we're also arguing that the Attorney General's requested interpretation of SB 180 would actually create constitutional issues, because it would then violate Kansans' constitutional rights to personal autonomy and privacy. And so that is really the crux of why we wanted to intervene, to stand up for trans Kansans' rights, just like the ACLU stands up for all Kansans' rights. And not only is it important because trans folks have that right, but because identity documents and trans folks' ability to have a gender marker that reflects their lived gender, it really impacts trans Kansans' daily safety and ability to have full and healthy lives in our state. And so we think it's important to stand up for those rights.
Now, I know you mentioned the birth certificate issue and then also driver's licenses, 2 very different ID documents. However, what exactly could we see differently play out in this case in Shawnee County? What arguments could come into play on the ACLU's side, and what rights does your organization say are protected under the Constitution?
So I won't get into the specifics of the legal arguments that we'll be making. Those will be detailed in depth in the briefings that we file in Kansas v. Harper, and those will be public, so everyone will be able to see those briefings when they're filed. But I will just note that all Kansans have a right to personal autonomy and privacy, including trans Kansans. And so that is what we're going to be uplifting in our arguments. And also we want to note that courts across the country have acknowledged this right in other contexts and have acknowledged that banning trans folks from accessing accurate driver's licenses raises constitutional concerns. And so we've seen that play out across the country, and we are hopeful that Kansas will end up on the right side as well.
All right, we'll be right back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
This month at Renewal by Andersen, get $350 off each window, $500 off patio doors, and free installation. But it's not as much about what you can save as it is what you can gain. To start, you gain options, endless options, with 11 hardware finishes, 49 color combinations, and stainable interiors, plus slim and sleek frames, custom shapes and sizes, and diverse grill options to create any look. Gain peace of mind with easy-to-open, easy-to-clean windows that are just as low maintenance as they are energy efficient. Our high-performance glass and Energy Star certification will even help you gain some savings on your heating and cooling bill. Right now, save big on windows and patio doors, plus get free installation. And 12 months, no money down, no interest, and no payments for qualified purchases. Call the number on your screen or visit rbabestoffer.com to take advantage of this exclusive offer. Explore your options today. Renewal by Andersen, the better way to a better window.
At 2 Men and a Truck, we'll treat you and your belongings like we'd treat our own grandmas.
Here we go!
Welcome. Whether we're moving you across town or even across the country.
The 27 News Storm Tracker is sponsored by D.L. Smith Electric, bringing your vision to life.
Devon James wins.
We're Devon James. As lawyers who focus on serious injuries, we know what really matters.
We've helped people get life-saving care after sudden accidents.
We've been there to restore hope during long recoveries.
And fought to provide a better future to those who need it most.
That's why at Devon James, we fight for everything you deserve.
And we will win your case, or you pay us nothing.
Devon James wins. Call 888-8888.
It's a new season in NYC.
Weekdays at 3.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung, continuing our conversation with DC Heegert with the ACLU to talk about one of the biggest legal challenges this year. The question, should gender markers changes be allowed on state records? DC, the ACLU argues that people have a constitutional right to change their gender markers on state records. But not everyone holds this opinion. We asked the Attorney General what he thinks about gender markers being changed on documents like birth certificates and licenses, and here's some of what he had to say. Do individuals get to exercise autonomy over their own identity? What do you say to those who believe in this case that right lies with the individual?
That's not them speaking on the driver's license. That's the state saying, if you want to be authorized to drive a car, here's the license you have to carry, and this is the information we, the state, choose to put on that license. And I would say also that, just thinking reasonably about this, most people, if they're presenting themselves to the world or to other people, they don't pull out their driver's license and say, here's who I am, everybody. And most people keep their driver's license tucked away in their purse or their wallet. They don't generally show that to the world. They don't want to reveal their driver's license number. So I don't think that the argument that the sex as indicated on the driver's license prohibits a person from expressing themselves, I don't think that argument holds water, because people don't usually express themselves by holding out their driver's license and saying, see, this is who I am.
Is it the right of the individual to exercise autonomy in this respect when it comes to state records? What would you say to some like the Attorney General, Kobach, who argue that changing gender markers could compromise the accuracy of these documents, which are also used to verify someone's identity? Who should be allowed to determine that? The doctor, the government, or the individual?
Yeah, so I think that the response that we just saw was sort of evidenced of just how out of touch the arguments the Attorney General's office is making to the daily lives of trans folks in our state. Because trans folks, just like any other Kansan, are showing their ID for countless reasons. When they're going to pick up an item, maybe picking up liquor or going to the gas station to buy something, that you have to verify your age, if you're voting, if you're renting a car, if you are going to the doctor, or if you're applying to a job. I mean, the list really is endless of all the ways that you do have to use your driver's license as verification, you know, to show who you are and to show all the information that's on it to numerous people. And that is a problem for trans folks if that information on that card is outing them as trans, because that raises all sorts of privacy and safety concerns. And so I think it's really important that we note that this is not just a data collection piece. This actually impacts people's lives on a daily basis. And then to push back a bit on the framing the Attorney General had about the harms that it would cause for trans folks to be able to access an accurate gender marker. It's interesting because the Kansas Department of Revenue, for example, has been allowing trans folks in the state of Kansas to change their gender marker on their license for well over a decade. And we haven't seen any problems with trans folks being able to do that in all those years. And so it's just sort of an inaccurate balance of harms, because there has been no issues to point to from trans folks being able to access an accurate gender marker. But on the flip side, if you look at, there's lots of research that shows when trans folks are unable to access an accurate gender marker on their ID, they are exposed to significantly more amounts of harassment, violence, discrimination, and issues of more unemployment and dealing with poverty related to discrimination because of their trans identity. And so I think really when you're looking at how this plays out in the day-to-day lives of trans folks, this is a crucial aspect of trans folks' ability to have personal autonomy and privacy that all other Kansans get to have in their daily lives.
And to his point, could an issue arise with having an individual, though, determine their identity when it comes to records? So when it comes to identifying someone for legal, medical, or security purposes, should there be a boundary set for how people are identified?
I think there's lots of various reasons that maybe in certain settings, you know, a healthcare provider or someone needs to know private personal information that impacts someone's, you know, healthcare or something like that. But that applies to, you know, cisgender folks and transgender folks. And so it's not really accurate to say that the marker that's on your driver's license means that no other record of that information can exist anywhere. I think it's important that we talk about what's really at issue here, and we're talking about the, you know, four corners of the license. There can be databases of information elsewhere. There can be records that are removed from what's on your license. And so getting into the weeds there is really not what's at issue here. What we're talking about is what's on the driver's license, and that is the information that doesn't have a real impact to the state whether or not it's an affirming gender marker, but it does have a very, very profound impact on the individual trans person that has to hold that ID.
Now, what about when it comes to fraud? Because I know that's also been an argument that's used. Some people may argue that lax processes to change gender markers on state records could lead to misuse of identity for nefarious purposes. So, for example, if someone with malicious intent is able to change their gender marker to match someone they plan to impersonate, could that not pose an issue? What would you say to people who have those concerns?
I think that when we are talking about trans folks, trans rights kind of in general, there's a lot of fear-mongering and discussion about, well, what if XYZ example, but it's not actually rooted in what's happening on the ground in reality. And I think that plays out in a lot of different contexts when there's fear-mongering. Not to analogize, but when we're talking about other contexts of maybe like voter fraud, and there's not real evidence on the ground of the fear that we're discussing. And so when we're talking about these things, I think it's important that we're grounding them in what's actually happening. And there's no evidence showing that trans people are, rampantly committing fraud because they're able to access a gender marker that affirms their identity. And actually, it's removed from the legal battles we're discussing here. There are still countless barriers for trans folks to be able to get a gender marker that affirms their gender identity. It's not as simple as someone showing up and saying hello and an XYZ option and getting what they want and leaving. There's lots of administrative barriers for trans folks in Kansas and across the country. So I think when we're having these discussions, grounding them in what it actually looks like for trans people is really important, so we don't get kind of caught up in those fear-mongering debates.
Thank you, DC. We're continuing our conversation after a short break. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
Do you struggle understanding conversation on the telephone? This month, all new patients receive a free captioned telephone. Call to reserve your consultation with New Sound because we care.
The Holton Weather Cam is sponsored by Ellis Boys, Chrysler, Dodge, Jeep, and Ram.
I grew up in a home that didn't have running water. My shoes always had holes in them. I know how it is to be poor. I listened to a message of Dr. Stanley's talking about, how you never really live your life until you actually give it away. He kind of gave me that push to get out there and really do something.
Huge savings going on now during Vanderbilt's fall clearance event. Wolverine I-90 work boots, $109.99. Hot price on Twisted X casual boot, $139.99. Ariat rebar work jeans, $52.99. Check out our new FXD workwear, pants, jackets, and hoodies. Special purchase on WF2 quarter zip, starting at $49.99.
Work boot center, Vanderbilt.
At Cox Mobile, we know that every family has different needs. That's why the more gig unlimited lines you add, the more everyone saves. Well, almost everyone. Now, when you switch to Cox Mobile, you'll pay as low as $30 per line when you add 4 or more gig unlimited lines. And it's all on the network with unbeatable 5G reliability. With no annual contract. Visit us today to get started. And bring the crew, too.
Join us for a weekly deep dive into Kansas City Chiefs football. KCN Zone. Friday nights at 10 on Fox 43 KTMJ.
Welcome back to Inside Kansas Politics. I'm Rebecca Chung, continuing our conversation with DC Heegert, legal fellow with the ACLU of Kansas. DC, in the past, people in favor of changing gender markers have cited the right to privacy. This, of course, is not explicitly stated in the U.S. Constitution, but rather implied through legal interpretations and amendments. One of the cases that establishes this right was overturned by the Supreme Court. Roe v. Wade established that the right to privacy includes the right to make decisions about contraception and abortion. Now that this decision was struck down, what happens next? We spoke with a political expert who weighed in.
The right to privacy and the federal law comes from cases in the 1960s and 70s where it essentially was ruled that it is implied by our other rights. We have a right against unlawful search and seizure. We have a right to freedom of assembly. We have a right to free speech. And a number of different rights, including the Ninth Amendment, which protects the rights not explicitly protected by the other amendments, those imply, the Supreme Court called it penumbrance, those imply a right to privacy. Well, the Roe v. Wade decision was based on that. It came from an earlier case, and of course that was overturned with the Dobbs decision. And so now the question is, will the U.S. Supreme Court overturn the right to privacy itself, which came from an earlier case about birth control called Griswold v. Connecticut? If they did, it could have a ripple effect that could affect a lot of laws, or potential laws, including this one.
Now, without this particular leg to stand on, it could make it more difficult to rely on the right to privacy argument. Are there any concerns that this could potentially create an obstacle when trying to argue your side in court?
So I think it's important to note that what the clip we were just watching was a discussion about federal constitutional case law and the interpretation of the U.S. Constitution. And in Kansas v. Harper, we are suing, we are intervening in that case, and our arguments are rooted in Kansas constitutional law. So those are two separate, there's some doctrine that overlaps there and similar interpretation, but we are rooting our arguments, our constitutional defense arguments, in Kansas constitutional law. And so it's a bit removed from what's happening in the federal context, though it is, it was accurate to note that some of the privacy rights that are swirling around at the federal level have become a bit more precarious as we see some of the decisions coming down from the Supreme Court that are chipping away at some of those rights.
And so does that present an issue, would you think, when also maybe arguing from Kansas's side?
So, a lot of our legal analysis will be included in the briefings that will be filed in the case, so the public can kind of see what our arguments are there. But I will just note that in Kansas, under the Kansas Constitution, the Kansas Supreme Court has found that all Kansans have a right to personal autonomy and a right to privacy that can flow from that right to personal autonomy. And so we will be rooting our arguments in that case law from the Kansas Supreme Court, which won't be impacted by the decision that impacted Roe.
Okay. Now, in our interview with Kobach, he also mentioned that people don't generally show their birth certificate, similar to licenses, as a way of saying, this is who I am. When he gave his legal opinion, he said that this shouldn't interfere with how transgender people choose to live and identify themselves. So why should people be allowed to change their gender markers on state records like birth certificates and licenses?
It's really crucial to trans folks' ability to actually live, as I mentioned earlier, full and healthy lives in our state. Because, whether you're talking about a birth certificate, which is a feeder document, which is just a term of art to say you use your birth certificate to get a lot of other important documents you need, like a driver's license or like a marriage license or certain different things you have to use that original birth certificate for. And so, that's going to impact a trans person every time they have to use it. And the same thing with driver's licenses. That is, used in a myriad of contexts. What's at the heart of this case is that trans folks, without the access to accurate gender markers on their licenses, are facing increased amounts of violence, increased amounts of discrimination, increased amounts of harassment in our state. And that's something that we could avoid if we were able to, what KDOR had been doing for a decade, prior, just allow them to have access to a gender marker that reflects who they live as, just like you're able to get one as a cisgender person that reflects who you live as.
Now, when it comes to birth certificates, now the state health department is not allowed to change gender markers on those documents. What's next for transgender people in the state? What's happening now?
Yeah, so, I think it's important to note that what's happening in Kansas v. Harper is separate from what's happening in the birth certificate context. And so we will see what's to come in that context with KDHE issuing its new policy. I think many advocates would say that the policy completely banning changes on birth certificates raises significant constitutional concerns. And so we'll have to see what's to come in that context. I will note that Kansas is one of only 5 states now that bans trans folks from amending their birth certificates to have an accurate gender marker. The vast majority of states in our country allow trans folks to do that. And for folks that live in Kansas and who are trans, I think it's important to note this only impacts you if you were born in Kansas. If you're born elsewhere, wherever you were born, that state's law dictates whether you can change your birth certificate. So if you're living in Kansas but not born here, you may still be able to change your birth certificate. And I think that's important to note.
DC, thank you. Coming up, the ACLU is tracking similar challenges to gender markers in other states as well. What's next across the country and in Kansas? We'll be right back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics.
Doughboys Pizzeria, a family restaurant in North Topeka, serving fresh pizza with our signature sauce, award-winning wings, awesome appetizers, and desserts, with outdoor dining and entertainment. Call or order online at doughboys.pizza.
The story of Grace Med has always been told through its people, both those who serve and those who it is our honor to serve. We meet at the intersection of compassion and vulnerability, bringing health where there was illness and hope where there was despair. Our patients come to us bearing the weight of living in the margins, and we share the love of Jesus Christ with them by providing compassionate, quality health care for all their physical, emotional, and spiritual needs. Because health restored is always hope renewed. Find hope today by scheduling an appointment with GraceMed.
We just lowered prices on our best floors at the Floor Project. I knew you'd like that, Ruggles.
And you will too when we put every luxury waterproof floor on sale. All brands featuring Cortec. All styles including Cortec planks and tiles. All looks from hand-scraped to textured. No one has more luxury vinyl floors in stock at savings up to 62% off and up to 60 months free financing too.
Save money, no worries. That's what the Floor Project is all about.
At 2 Men and a Truck, we'll treat you and your belongings like we'd treat our own grandmas.
Here we go. Hello there.
Welcome. Whether we're moving you across town or even across the country.
It's so refreshing to have a station right here in Northeast Kansas that really digs in and supports all the nonprofits. We wouldn't be able to do everything we do without KSNT's support.
Thank you, KSNT, for partnering with us and the Topeka Food Truck Festival. We had a fantastic turnout, exceeded all expectations.
Since we've started working with KSNT, we've had great fundraisers. We've broke fundraising records at all 3 of our events this year. It's a real blessing.
Welcome back. You're watching Inside Kansas Politics. D.C., from my understanding, the ACLU isn't just fighting Kansas's new law, but also similar laws in other states. What's being done there, and what's the potential for more legislation to arise in Kansas that's related to this issue, and what could we see come up next year?
Yeah, for sure. So, the ACLU has affiliates in every state. I'm a part of the ACLU of Kansas office, but there are, civil rights attorneys across the country that are focused on fighting these anti-trans bills that are passing. Kansas's SB 180 was novel to a certain extent this past legislative session, but we're seeing litigation across the country enforcing the ability of trans folks to access accurate IDs, to access restrooms, to access healthcare. There's sort of a myriad context of litigation going on across the country. We've seen a lot of laws pass in those states limiting healthcare, and so Kansas is now one of the sole providers in the Midwest for gender-affirming care, and so I think that's going to be top of mind from some of the folks that were trying to pass those bills last session, and it's certainly a concern for advocates because access to gender-affirming care is crucial and life-saving.
D.C., thank you again. And that was your look inside Kansas politics. If you want to keep up to date on all things Kansas politics, then follow us on social media. Follow us on Twitter at @InKansasPolitics and on Facebook. Just search Inside Kansas Politics. We'll also post the full video on YouTube. Just search KSNT News and check ksnt.com/inside-kansas-politics for past episodes. If you have a story you want Kansas state legislators to hear or topics you think we should cover, let us know. You can email us at ikp@ksnt.com. We'll see you right here, same time, same place. Have a good day.